So Susan, Anchorage, it's probably changed a lot since you were young. Tell us what it was like growing up there.
Well, it's definitely changed. It had a population of about 50,000 people when I was a young child. It didn't have paved roads except right downtown. I can remember living in Spenard, and Spenard Road wasn't paved, and Arctic Boulevard, which ran on the other side of the road where we lived, was just two-wheel tracks through the swamp. It really wasn't even developed. And now those are both major thoroughfares, but there are also lots and lots of other roads that didn't exist when I was a child. We didn't have the big chain stores, of course, that we have now. All of the shops and stores were local. We were very fond, and I talked about some of this in the radio interview, but we were very fond of the Caribou store because they installed the first escalator in town, and it was a huge thrill to go and ride the escalator up and down, up and down. I can just imagine that the store staff were not that thrilled to have all the neighborhood kids riding the escalator, but we were always looking for something to do. So.
Now, you were there for the '64 earthquake, and you and a friend had a pretty harrowing experience, but that was nothing to the friend who was in that house turning in a slide area.
Sure. In Spenard, where we lived, there really wasn't that much obvious damage. No buildings fell down, really. We had a few big fissures opening up as we were running outside and standing outside. We saw the power lines whipping back and forth and sparking before the power went out, and then we looked down at our feet and there were cracks opening up under our feet. A little bit alarming, but really we were lucky in the area where we lived. As I say, there was really very little damage. One of my school friends lived in the Turnagain subdivision, and she rode her house all the way down the slide area down to the inlet. It must have been an extremely frightening experience. My father was driving down 4th Avenue during the time of the earthquake, and he saw the side on the slide area slide away, so he decided to go faster. And he drove up to C Street, turned, and drove out to Spenard where we lived, and got home within just minutes after the earthquake ended. And when we went back later, we walked back the route where he had taken. It was absolutely impassable because there were lots of big chunks of C Street that had slid up and down. So we're not quite sure how he got home, but he did.
Yeah, I think willpower and a good gas pedal kind of can see you through some of those things. Now, you eventually went into chemical oceanography, but you say Anchorage wasn't the community, didn't inspire you for that future career, but going fishing with your uncle.
Sure. Both my father and my uncle loved to fish. I'm not sure really that it was the fishing that was so much the point. It was more going out in the boat and sitting on the water and sitting all day and not doing very much except holding your fishing pole that was probably the point. But we would go fishing many times during the summer in various places, and I grew to really enjoy the ocean and all the things that we would pull up, many of which weren't really edible. Irish lords, I think some of you have probably caught those. We used to get those quite a bit, and they're very bony. The Anchorage area, of course, as many of you know, it borders on the ocean, but they're all mud flats, so there's really not a whole lot of opportunity to go beach combing or any of those things that tend to interest people in the oceans. But my uncle lived in Haines, and there were lovely beaches there that were spent lots of time walking them and looking under rocks and seeing what was there. So, the path to oceanography wasn't very clear, I guess, as a child. Like most children, I had lots of different ideas about what I wanted to be when I grew up. But eventually it kind of solidified around wanting to do something with the ocean.
Well, and as I understand it, what you said, the radio interview is, you went into University of Washington, Seattle as a chemistry major, but the kind of experience in the lab wasn't really that pleasurable.
Not so much. When I went to college, I wanted to pick a major where I was sure I could get a job when I graduated, and chemistry seemed like a good choice. My guidance counselors in school said, oh yes, if you major in chemistry, you'll be sure to get a good job. But then I went to the University of Washington, and their chemistry labs were held in a very old building. I'm not sure exactly how old it was, probably 50 or 100 years, something like that, called Bagley Hall. And the organic chemistry labs were in the basement of Bagley Hall, way down these dark corridors with no ventilation. I would have organic chemistry lab twice a week, and it was during the spring semester. The lab was extremely hot. We were using all sorts of solvents, but the one I remember was benzene, which wouldn't be used in an undergraduate lab now because it's carcinogenic and has some other unpleasant properties. But we were using it then, and you could see the fumes vaporizing off of the test tubes, and the smell was almost overwhelming. So after one of those labs, I went out into the sunshine. Oh boy, this is nice. I'm not in that lab anymore. And I went immediately down to the oceanography building and signed up for an oceanography major instead of chemistry, because I just didn't want to spend my life in one of those labs.
Did you enjoy being outdoors? I mean, in the sense that oceanography, rather than, let's say, botany or some other discipline, was that the sense of being out in the field part of the allure?
Well, being out on the ocean, I don't know that I ever had much of a desire to do, for instance, the sort of thing that my daughter is doing now. She's a graduate student that's studying scrub jays in the Channel Islands for her dissertation research. And they spend a lot of time beating through the underbrush and trying to find these nests, and then they have cameras on poles and they're looking for the nests, and there's bugs and it's hot and there's poison sumac. And anyway, she tells me all sorts of things about the joys of doing that kind of research. And even when I was thinking about my career, actually, that sort of thing didn't appeal very much. But I was interested in the oceans, interested in being out on ships, interested in having that experience.
Did University of Washington in Seattle offer you those opportunities? Did you ever get out?
Well, they had a student research vessel. I use the term loosely. I think it was a recycled fishing boat. It was, I can't actually remember which one that they sent us out on. It was either the Onar or maybe the Ho, can't remember the names of them, but they weren't particularly large, fishing boat sized, and not particularly comfortable to ride in if there was any kind of a sea. They would really roll. I think they were retired and scuttled sometime fairly shortly after I graduated, because they were old wooden hull vessels. I think that they had shipworms, and they decided that they couldn't be fixed and retired them.
It's amazing you got through your undergraduate degree program at all, what with the chemicals and the unseaworthy vessels you went out on. But,
well,
yeah,
it wasn't
I'm
that
kidding you,
bad.
But you went to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which is very prestigious. Did they have a program in particular that you wanted to follow? How did you hit on them?
Well, they did have a program in chemical oceanography, which is what I wanted to do my graduate work in. But the reason that I went there probably was a fellow called Jim Murray, who was one of the professors at the University of Washington, and he was a graduate of Woods Hole. And he started lobbying some of the seniors in the oceanography course to go to Woods Hole when they graduated, and he was pretty persuasive. He, said it was just the most wonderful place to study oceanography, sort of like a used car salesman. There was some truth in what he was saying, and some things that weren't maybe quite so true, but it basically was a very good place to study oceanography. There were lots of resources, lots of brilliant people to study with.
Mm-hmm. Are any of the work you did there stand out in your memory as particularly vivid or?
Well, we had at that time, my major professor was a fellow called John Farrington, a wonderful mentor, but he had, along with several other people, some research projects that were studying the upwelling regions of the world, which are these areas which have highly productive fisheries. The places that we went included an area called Wallfish Bay in South Africa, off Namibia actually, and then the Peru upwelling region off the coast of South America. And for somebody who had lived all of her life in Alaska and then in Seattle for 4 years as an undergraduate, going to those far-flung locations was, wow. It was an experience that I was very excited about at the time, and had many interesting adventures getting to these locations and getting back from these locations, because travel in those areas of the world at that time had its challenges. For instance, when we were flying down to Johannesburg to get on a train to go to Cape Town, which is where we were going to catch the research vessel, we got as far as Kinshasa and what was then Zaire, and they announced on the PA system, well, the airspace over Angola has closed, so our flight is going to terminate here in Kinshasa. And we went, well, what do we do? And they said, just stay here. Don't leave the airport. It's not safe. And so we did. And we stayed there for a couple of days. And then on the PA system, a woman came on the PA system, one of the flight attendants, and she said, the flight crew took a vote and we've decided to go on. But we can't tell you where we're going, but anyone that would like to get on the aircraft with us is welcome. So we all got back on the aircraft. And well, anyway, to make a long story short, we flew for 8 hours and ended up in Johannesburg. But what they had done was to go then eastward and down all the way to went eastward all the way to the Indian Ocean and down, so that they didn't have to fly over Angola. But it wasn't an authorized air route, so they never really told us how we got to Johannesburg. We just got there and we were fine because we were in the place that we were going.
Wow. When you got your PhD and decided on a place, Alaska was calling, is that right?
Yes, I spent, of course, 5 years in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which is where Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is. And I don't know if any of you have ever spent any time on Cape Cod. It's actually quite nice in the winter, hardly anybody there. Weather's a little bit blustery, but oh well. But in the summertime, it is just packed, just wall-to-wall people all the time. You can't drive anywhere, at least at that time, without spending hours just inching along in very tight traffic. And then I did a postdoc in San Diego and got the opportunity to learn to drive on freeways, but I didn't really like it very much. I used to go to work at 6 in the morning and then come home about 8 at night to try to avoid the traffic, because I just couldn't really get my reflexes going in terms of dealing with 6 or 8 lanes of traffic. And about that time, a job became available in Alaska, and I went, this looks a lot better. This is something that I could find easier to adapt to than all of these crowds. So,
you know, you've mentioned being on board ship on a couple occasions and taking samples. I guess I should ask, do you get seasick?
Not usually. Sugai thinks I never get seasick, but it's possible to make me seasick, and really awful conditions would sometimes come up. But yeah, luckily I was pretty well adapted to oceanography as a profession, because many of my colleagues suffered a lot that I don't usually.
Yeah, well, and of course, being a woman researcher, what were the accommodations for women, let's say Alpha Helix or some of the other research vessels?
Well, they were similar to the accommodations for everybody in most of these places, although when I went out on what was called the Lulu, which this was back when I was a graduate student, and the Lulu was the tender for the submersible Alvin. And so I went out on that vessel, and there were no accommodations for women on that vessel because the men slept in the pontoons, because the Lulu was basically two pontoons and a grid work that joined the two, and that was all there was to her. And so it wasn't a very sturdy looking craft, and they housed the women in what we called a helicopter hut, which was just basically a little prefab container that they had lashed down to the grid work on deck, and they had stuffed 6 bunks into it. It was about 8 feet long and 6 feet wide and 6 feet high. Anyway, it was kind of cozy. So we got to spend the trip in that accommodation, but we also on that trip got caught in the fringe of a hurricane, which made the weather extremely rough, and the waves were. It turns out when Lulu gets into heavy weather, the waves would come up through the pontoons and in kind of a fountain up through the grid work, and then splash on top of the helicopter hut, which leaked. But so that was a bracing experience, shall we say.
Yeah, a very bracing experience. Well, as long as I'm asking about women, were there women researchers that were models or mentors for you, or there weren't many women researchers, were there, in your field?
Well, in oceanography, there really hadn't been very many women at all up until several years before I went over to Woods Hole. When I was at University of Washington, there was only one woman on the faculty there. Her name was Joyce Lewin, and she was a biological oceanographer. At Woods Hole, I don't recall that there were any women in the chemical oceanography area. There were a couple in the biology department, and they hadn't admitted any women graduate students up until the year before I came, except very occasionally. And their rationale was that if you were going to be an oceanographer, you had to go on ships, and ships weren't a suitable place for women. So they weren't going to be taking any women into the oceanography programs. But the federal government, which supplied a lot of their funding at one point, a couple of years before I went there, told them, nope, you're not doing that anymore. We have these rules about equal opportunities, so you're going to start admitting women to oceanography programs. And when they realized they had to do that, they started admitting at least a third or so of each class were women. So I had peers in my graduate program that were women, but there weren't many women role models there.
Mm-hmm. And when you got to UAF, well, let's just jump ahead briefly and kind of talk about this together. How about in administration? Were there a lot of women at UAF here, or in your experience, women administrators? Did you have role models or that were your future career as an administrator?
Well, I'll start by saying that when I was a faculty member, up until rather late in the time that I was a faculty member, I had no interest in being an administrator, so I wasn't really thinking in those directions. But of course, Vera Alexander was the director of the Institute of Marine Science here when I was hired. For those of you who don't know, probably most of you do, Vera was the first woman PhD graduate of UAF back in the 1960s. And then by the time I came here, she was the administrator in charge of the Institute of Marine Science. But there weren't, as I can recall, any other, well, there weren't any other women faculty in the Institute of Marine Science. And I think the only woman administrator who was hired about that time, or maybe a little later, was Karen Sedso, who was in charge of university relations. I don't recall.
I know Wendy Redmond was at
That's
UA
right, yeah.
statewide.
Yeah.
Well, I just thought it's interesting. You kind of forged, and set some high bar marks in your time as an administrator. But let's go back now to when you first arrived here. What was the department like, and what kind of research did you launch yourself into when you got here?
Well, there were many wonderful people here at the Institute of Marine Science, which was then mostly housed in the O'Neill building, well, over there, I guess, get my bearings here. And also in the Irving II building, which was the place where I had my office. There weren't a lot of people doing exactly the same kind of research that I was doing. So I mostly had projects largely on my own, but I did do some collaborations with Bill Rehberg in particular, who was a researcher here. And his research area was a place, or one of his favorite research areas was a place in the Aleutians called Scan Bay. It's a bay in embayment on Alaska Island. But kind of around the corner from Dutch Harbor, which is a major port. But the interest in Scan Bay is that the water and the sediments of that bay are what's called anoxic, or devoid of oxygen. So it makes for some really interesting chemistry in the water because all of the oxygen has been consumed by bacterial decay.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're looking, a chemical oceanographer focuses on these chemical operations that obviously take place in the ocean, but they're foundational. Would I have that right? They're foundational for other aspects, obviously for microorganisms and the food chain going up from them.
Sure, chemical oceanographers firmly think that it is the most important branch of oceanography. There are lots of aspects of it that really inform the other disciplines of oceanography. For instance, one of the things that chemical oceanographers measure, although it wasn't one of my specialties, is the nutrients in the water, the substances like nitrate and phosphate that the phytoplankton or plant plankton need in order to grow. And so really the biological oceanographers can't do very much unless they understand the distribution of the nutrients. And another thing that many chemists measure are various kinds of tracers, which are basically chemicals that help the physical oceanographers figure out where water circulates in the ocean.
Okay. So in your discipline then, Susan, it strikes me that probably computers were just coming online then. And I know when we talked earlier, you said they played a profound role in increasing the amount of data that a researcher could to gather.
Sure.
Is that right?
Sure. Along with some other developments in instrumental analysis, analytical chemistry. When I was a graduate student, we were proud to produce 4 data points and publish them. We thought that was great. We would work for a whole year sometimes to get that amount of information. But we were doing everything manually. I can remember we would pack columns for our gas chromatographs, and these were just long pieces of 1/8 inch tubing, stainless steel tubing, and we were packing the chemical substances into them that were going to help us do the gas chromatography. We would do that in the stairwell. We would take this long piece of tubing and then just be trying to tamp the packing down into the tubing in the stairwell. And that was not a very smooth operation, I guess. I look back on it now. Nobody would do such a thing today. Gas chromatography columns have changed dramatically. Now they're normally made out of quartz, and they're drawn into a very fine capillary tube. And so instead of this cumbersome 1/8-inch stainless steel tubing that gave you very crude separations of chemicals, you get extremely precise separations of sometimes hundreds or thousands of different substances within your sample. So it makes a huge difference to have that kind of capability. But then to get back to the computers, you would never be able to deal with all that information if you didn't have computers. Again, back in the day when I was in graduate school, the results of the analysis would come out on peaks that were scribed by a pen on a piece of paper. And in order to get the concentration of the substance, we would take rulers and little reticles that we could look through, measure the peaks very precisely, and then we would, by hand, calculate. Mind you, we didn't even really have very good calculators in those days. Sometimes on a slide rule, we would calculate the area of the peaks, and it was a very slow and cumbersome process. Now, of course, the area of the peak automatically comes out in a printout at the end of the run, all measured through the magic of electronics. And sometimes you can interface that instrument with something else called a gas chromatograph, which automatically tells you what compound it is, too, coming out in that peak, which used to be a lot of trouble for us to try to figure out. So anyway, a lot of picky little details, but it's much easier to get lots and lots of information these days. It can be challenging, though, to reduce that information to cents rather than just reams and reams and reams of information. Or actually, we don't use paper anymore. It's all in this digital file, but you have to be able to somehow reduce those many hundreds or thousands of numbers to something that you can think about, interpret, and relate to other information.
When you were talking, taking samples isn't easy in chemical oceanography, is it?
No, Susan Sugai there in the audience can certainly testify to that, since we went out on many trips together to gather samples. So we would gather both water samples and sediment samples in much of our research. And I'm not sure which is, well, no, the water samples are easier. I take that back. The sediment samples are, the water samples, the main challenge was once we got them on deck, we were just out in the open in the wind and the freezing cold, and we were trying to draw the water samples sometimes out of the sampling bottles, but unless we did that quickly, they would just freeze in place sometimes in some of the worst winter weather. And of course, it was pretty unpleasant being on deck and trying to do all that in the freezing cold. But the sediment samples are something else. The sediment is just the mud on the seafloor, and you wouldn't think we would go through all that trouble to get mud from the seafloor, but it actually preserves a record of the history of the oceans in the mud. So many people study that layer by layer. And oceanographers have come up with all sorts of devices to try to get those samples from the seafloor. There are box cores, which are aptly named because they're shaped like boxes. There's piston cores. There's, well, again,
lots of cores.
Lots of different kinds. But they're all characterized by being mechanically difficult. So they have various moving parts that don't want to move because they're corroded, and they're very heavy typically because you want to have a lot of weight on them so that they'll squash down into the mud and bring you back a good sample. Then you're working with them on a rolling deck, and you have this huge heavy thing with lots of weights on it, and you're trying to get it up and over the side without getting anybody creamed with it. And so lots of adventures in sediment sampling. When we would go to Scan Bay with this anoxic mud down at the bottom of Scan Bay, it smells like hydrogen sulfide. That's generated by the bacteria that live in the sediment, so it smells just awful. And the whole ship would smell like hydrogen sulfide, and the sediment was black, and it would get all over everything. The back deck would be covered in black mud, and the lab would be covered in black mud. And we were forbidden to go farther into the ship than the lab with our rain gear and everything on, because they didn't want black mud all over the rest of the ship either. Anyway, it's not a tidy science, oceanography. You're often wallowing in the mud.
You don't share this when you're recruiting, I hope.
No. Well, I had a graduate student years ago who eventually became an airline pilot, and he discovered a little late that he really didn't like mud. He didn't like touching it. He didn't like being around it. It just, ugh.
I'm with him. The way you describe it, I'm surprised you survived your scientific career. But you said when you started out, you had no idea about being an administrator. It wasn't even, and I can see some of these experiences might lend someone to go into administration. But what was it that you decided, Susan, to go that way?
Well, there were several different things, I think, that came together. As we talked about in the radio interview, I did want to, as time went on, have more influence on how things were, and I thought administrators controlled things. I thought administrators could make things happen, and sometimes we can. It's a little more difficult than it looks from the outside, though. For example, I taught an undergraduate class, Introductions to the Oceans, for a long time, and I saw many students struggling in those classes. I wanted to find some better ways to make them successful academically, or help themselves to be successful academically. So being an administrator, at least to the extent of being a program head, started to be appealing. But there also were some other things. Those ships that we've been talking about, of course, they roll a lot when you're out working, and going out on ships was grand adventure when I was 20. It was still a lot of fun when I was in my 30s. Got into my 40s, and well, that was okay. But then I got older, and it just began to lose its appeal a little bit. I still remember a Bering Sea cruise I took in 1998, which was still some time before I stopped being a researcher, but it was aboard the Waikoma, which was an Oregon State research vessel, and we had a month of almost nothing but wind and gale and heavy seas, 40 knots, 70 knots, just wind just blowing all the time. One particularly nasty night, the master of the vessel came down into the science lab, and he said, I've never felt the boat shudder like this before. And I sort of wish that he'd kept that thought to himself. But it didn't fall apart, so that's the good news. We managed to come back in one piece, but we didn't actually get any research done, hardly, because the weather was so foul that we just spent all our time trying to head into the wind and keep the ship relatively stable. And so it was just a kind of a wasted 30 days where we couldn't do any sampling. And most voyages don't turn out like that. Normally we get a whole lot done, but that's the sort of thing that made me begin to think that was I really going to want to do this when I was 60?
Well, speaking of vessels, the Sikuliak seems to be a step up in terms of our last research vessel.
Yes. Yeah, the Alpha Helix, of course, was a loyal vessel, about, I think it was 143 feet long, relatively small, certainly very hardworking crew, very hardworking vessel. We got a lot done with her. But she had a nickname, and it was Rolfa Helix. She had, as one of the masters of the vessel explained to me once, had what's called a ringing hull. She was actually originally designed to be able to work in broken ice. And so the round bottom was there so that if she was in ice and started to get squeezed, the ice would lift it up instead of crushing her. Good news if she was working in ice, but not so good news if she was working in the Gulf of Alaska, where, as Dr. Storm Tom Royer used to say, one of the most dynamic oceanographic environments on Earth. Lots of wind and lots of seas. Anyway, Alpha Helix was a relatively small vessel, and with this ringing hull, one that really, really rolled in bad weather. The Sikuliak's much larger. I actually can't right offhand remember the length, but it's about 240 feet, I think. And just many more laboratory facilities, computer lab facilities, very nice quarters for both science and crew. Looks like, sure, a working vessel, but really a cut up in creature comforts from most of the ones that I spent my research career on. The Sikuliak has one feature that I just love. I've never got to use it, but it's called a Baltic room. But instead of the water sampling bottles being brought up by the crane and set on deck, they're actually brought in through some big double doors and come inside the vessel and sit there, and then you can come out and get your water samples, and you don't have to be out in the wind and the weather. And really, that's a very civilized way to do oceanography. Sorry they didn't think of it sooner.
Yeah, well, but so, I mean, I guess as an administrator, to go back to that piece, you're constrained by certain things, faculty senate issues, and I'm sure, but when the university first encountered its fiscal challenge in the late 80s, you were here, but you weren't an administrator. But now we're passing through another period of challenge. That must make the task of being an administrator especially hard.
Well, it certainly has been a challenge for these past several years. And one thing that I'm sure that everyone in the room realizes is that the challenge with appropriately dealing with budget reductions isn't so much that you can't possibly find something that you could cut back on. The difficulty is that everybody has a different idea about what that thing should be. So the difficulty is in working with people to try to find some level of agreement about how to approach budget reductions. We end up doing many across-the-board cuts where everybody takes a little bit of a cut. That means that things don't get eliminated, but everything suffers and everything doesn't work quite as well as it once did. But we have had to make some difficult decisions. We've needed to eliminate some programs that I, for one, didn't really want to see eliminated. But there's just no choice when you have really substantial budget cuts, as we have had the past several years.
Yeah, but everybody who I talked to that experienced your leadership style said you always had the information at hand, but you didn't micromanage anybody. You tried to give them the room to operate as they saw best. Is that one of the, as a researcher, was that something you learned from that end? Or did you see somebody model that kind of leadership style?
Well, I'm not sure I ever designed a leadership style for myself. I think I practiced the leadership of what works in the situation that arises. But it's certainly important to trust the people that work for you and trust that they know what they're doing, unless and until perhaps they demonstrate that they don't. But most of the time they do everything that they need to do and more. And I think that I've benefited a great deal from working with a lot of people that have brought skills and knowledge to the table that I myself didn't have.
Yeah. The other point that people would point out is your concern for students. I want to mention once again, you developed a scholarship fund. And so UAF has a pretty unique student body. We talked about in the radio interview about returning students or non-traditional students, and also mentioned a little bit about rural students serving communities in the satellite campus areas. All of those pose a great deal of challenges too.
Sure. Well, back to the scholarship fund, actually the one that has my name on it is one that Dana Thomas started on my behalf. And when he was serving as interim chancellor, he wanted to do a few things for the university during that time, and so he and Kay, his wife, were very generous in starting that particular scholarship fund. But I've donated to a variety of other scholarships over the years, and the focus for me in giving to scholarships is always to assist students that have financial need and who wouldn't be able to go to college if they weren't getting some scholarship support, or maybe they'd be able to go to college but they'd have to work more, they'd have to take out a lot of student loans, and they wouldn't have as many opportunities to be successful. And actually, part of that stems from the stories that my mother told me as a child, because she studied to be a school teacher long ago. She was going to college in the 1940s, and her father had passed away during the Depression. She had no money. Her family was quite poor, and she depended on what little financial aid was available at that time to try to eke her way through school. So I've always remembered that, and I know there are many people that have that same kind of experience. I myself was very fortunate to be helped a lot by my parents in going to college, although I had a few summer jobs like sliming salmon and so forth, but received a lot of help from my own parents in going to college.
Yeah, so, but about the unique student body here, we talked a little bit about it, but I think it's worth mentioning again. It seems that the university and how it delivers classes and engages with students is changing, and technology is one of those approaches towards teaching that is playing a bigger role these days.
Sure. The success of our e-learning programs has been something that I've really enjoyed seeing, because I think UAF's e-learning program is doing very well in expanding educational opportunities for people all across the state who wouldn't necessarily be able to come to a campus and attend college as a full-time student. And e-learning years ago, of course, wasn't e-learning, it was correspondence courses, and suffered from a reputation for not having particularly good quality. But now with all the technological tools that we have, the experience of e-learning can really be maybe not the same as a classroom, but certainly can have learning outcomes that are equally good. So I see that, at least for the next period of time, 5 years, 10 years, as really being the way that the university can reach out to a wider variety of students that wouldn't have had access to higher education otherwise. But I'm eager to see what comes up next. Virtual reality university, I'm not sure. But the technology is evolving so rapidly that I think the way that we do e-learning or the way we do classroom teaching is not going to be the same in 5 or 10 years. I think there'll be a lot of changes, and I'll watch them from afar.
Well, the other aspect too are rural communities that we attempt to serve, and those students, and trying to incorporate them into the academic life.
Sure. And the rural communities, of course, face a lot of different challenges, and one of them is not having very good internet connectivity. So they can't benefit as easily from online options as students that live in more urban areas. Some of that will probably be rectified with this quintillion project that's bringing fiber across the Arctic Ocean. So many of the coastal communities anyway around the northern and western part of Alaska are going to see a real upgrade to their internet shortly. But I think there are going to be a variety of other solutions that are going to make things easier for those remote communities. I just don't know what they are. I'm kind of a troglodyte about technology. I alluded to the fact that my first computational device was a slide rule, and I've progressed beyond that, but not to the stage that some of the people are today. So I think that these technological options are going to open doors for students in rural communities, but until then, and there's still some time before this is going to be a reality, our rural campuses do a great job in reaching out to students through the means that they have, often even just over the telephone, to offer various kinds of educational opportunities.
And when we spoke earlier, you were pleased at the increase in number of Alaska Native students here receiving degrees and graduate degrees and whatnot.
Sure. Alaska Native students don't have yet as good a success rates when we're measuring them in the standardized way that is measured nationally, which is what is their graduation rate at 6 years after they enrolled? What's their graduation rate at 4 years after they enrolled? They really lag behind. But something that we found out when we looked at this in more detail is that in terms of numbers of graduates from programs, so the proportion of graduates, say at the baccalaureate level or the associate level or the certificate level, the proportion of graduates is either equal to or even greater than the proportion of Alaska Natives in the population being served. So they are succeeding and getting many degrees and certificates. It's just that it appears to be taking longer. Instead of them following the traditional path and finishing a degree quickly in 4 years, it might take 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years or longer for them to complete a degree. But another thing that's been happening in the past 10 years is that I'm seeing a much higher proportion of Alaska Native people finishing master's and now doctoral degrees. When I was graduate school dean, the University of Alaska Fairbanks had graduated only 4 Alaska Native people in all of its history with a doctoral degree, which was pretty disgraceful, actually, I felt from my standpoint. Now we have dozens of Alaska Native graduates with doctoral degrees, and many of them through the Indigenous Studies program, some of them in the sciences, engineering, and other fields as well. So the number of Alaska Native people on the faculty has increased, and I think there's a lot of great opportunities there in the future.
Well, what do you think as you now retire? Friday was officially your last day. Woohoo! Yeah.
Yeah.
How are schools in general, maybe broaden it out from that, but are we preparing our students to be scientists, citizens, and working men and women?
Are you talking about universities or?
Yeah, universities.
Well, the university has prepared many people who have been very successful. If we look at our alumni, you'll see them leading in many state agencies. Many of them are faculty here at UAF. Many of them are employees in all walks of life in our communities across Alaska. So yes, we are preparing people to be successful. Does that mean that we are doing absolutely the best possible job and we couldn't do anything better? Well, of course not, because we are always looking at ways to improve. I think that the biggest challenge is that the world is changing and the demands of the workplace are changing. Say for our engineering program, for example, what the accrediting organization tells us is that, yeah, sure, they need engineers that can build a bridge that doesn't fall down, and those skills are a given. You must have that. But they also want graduates who can write well, who can speak well, and who can work well in teams, because that's the way that engineers work these days. They're not just sitting in a dusty little office all by themselves and working on their own. They need to be able to communicate well and work well with other people. And I think that that's true of other areas as well. And that's something that we need to be looking at very carefully over time. How can we improve not just the knowledge that students have, but the abilities and skills that they have to work in the kinds of jobs that they're likely to get.
Well, finally, I can't leave our discussion without acknowledging that your leadership style even goes to your exercise regimen, because along with Joan Braddock and Susan Sagai, you developed Trashercise. And would you tell us what that is?
Well, that, of course, is just a made-up name, but...
I don't know. You could copyright it. There might be some money there.
For quite a few years, Joan and Susan and I have been going out lunchtime, usually once a week, at least when we're all in town. Now that Susan and Joan are retired, it's harder to rope them in because they go to distant places more often. But we just go out and around campus and pick up trash. It is surprisingly good exercise because you bend and pick and pick. It maybe isn't a whole body workout. You know, it's kind of selective in terms of the particular muscles that it exercises. But we get some enjoyment out of that. It's always you get a feeling of accomplishment. It's actually kind of good compared with some days that I have in the office where I'm not really getting that feeling of accomplishment. And then I go out and I walk around campus and I pick up bits of trash along with Susan and Joan, and it looks so much cleaner. It's great.
Well, I think it's remarkable. I don't know how many administrators go out and help clean up literally the campus. But Susan Henrichs, thank you so much for talking with us this evening.
Well, thank you.
Now, are there any questions from the ringer?
Susan, I've been fascinated with the fact that you have two sets of twins. That wasn't even brought up during this interview, and how you managed to do that balancing act that those of us who are parents and have full-time careers pulled it off.
Well, obviously it was challenging. They're all grown up now. That my sons are 30 and my daughters are 26. So, and the good news is that they seem to have survived whatever parenting experience I gave them. But yeah, I mean, life is always a juggling act for everyone. You always have so many conflicting needs and priorities and trying to budget one's time. And I think sometimes I didn't do enough for my children, and sometimes I didn't do enough for my job, but it all worked out in the end. Joan Braddock loves to tell the story, so I'll just repeat it. One time she asked me to address a class that she was teaching that had the topic of something like women in science and how do women succeed in science and what are women doing in science. And she basically asked me to speak a little bit about how I managed to have my children and manage my children during the day. So, and part of what I said was, well, it's really easy if you don't have to get them dressed in the morning. The key to this is getting them dressed at night and putting them to bed with their clothes on, and then you're good to go in the morning. Yeah, believe me, when you first get the little kids out of bed in the morning, many of you know this, they're cranky and difficult. So anyway, I don't actually recommend that necessarily.
Good technique. What?
Hi. I heard that they were going to do a program on this Kodiak where you could connect with the rest of the world in classrooms. Is that happening?
I haven't seen a real-time one. That doesn't mean that they haven't happened. I have seen a lot of recorded programs that they've shown, and those have been really high quality and very nice.
Well, thank you again, Susan Henrichs.
Okay, thanks, Bob.